Good evening, and welcome to this International Center for Moral Injury webinar. My name is Brian Powers. I'm the Executive Director of the International Center for Moral Injury, or the ICMI, and I'm glad you've joined us this evening, as I'll welcome my colleagues Paul Conway, Aaron Pycroft, and Peter Lee to present the results of the first phase of a project examining the experience of moral injury amongst British military chaplains, titled Crisis of Faith, Moral Injury, Faith, and Wellbeing in Retired UK Military Chaplains and Civilian Clergy. At the outset, I'd just like to say a few brief words about the International Center for Moral Injury, which is committed to producing and receiving new scholarship on moral injury, facilitating new research by building networks of academic scholars, military members, chaplains, clergy, and others with knowledge of and experience with moral injury. The ICMI seeks to create and develop resources for counselors, caregivers, churches, and faith organizations caring for morally injured individuals. Each of these things serves the center's ultimate goal of increasing an understanding of the causes and impacts of moral injury and facilitating increased care for those who are experiencing it. Lastly, let me just note that all conversations on moral injury may evoke intense reactions within us. We will be discussing moral injury, perhaps at times in a lot of data tonight, but still in ways that can evoke reactions within us. So please do exercise self-care and stepping away if you need to, and know that there is help available if you feel overwhelmed. Please do explore the link we'll list below for lifeline-international.com in the Q&A box for help that is available wherever you are. So, without further ado, let me introduce my esteemed colleagues and research partners for this project. Dr. Paul Conway is a social psychologist, associate professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Southampton, and the primary investigator on this phase of the project. Dr. Aaron Pycroft is associate professor in criminal justice and social complexity at the University of Portsmouth. Professor Peter Lee is professor of applied ethics at the University of Portsmouth, former RAF chaplain and author of the book Reaper Force: Inside Britain's Drone Wars. I, of course, am a systematic theologian here at Durham University and Van Fellow in Christianity in the armed forces here as well. So I'm delighted to share this time with these gentlemen and look forward to the conversation to follow. So Pete, I will turn things over to you to set us in context before turning over to Paul.
Thanks very much, Brian. Good evening, everybody. It's fantastic to be here, and for me to be with Paul and Aaron and Brian is a particular pleasure. I've rarely known a research group mesh together as well as this four, and we don't get enough time to do all the things that we'd like to research. I'd like to give a little bit of background to say how we kind of got started with this, and some of that's quite personal to me. Brian mentioned that I am a former RAF chaplain, and those on here who know me will know that I left chaplaincy in 2008 to start my academic career because I really wasn't very well as a result of my chaplaincy and wartime experiences. And fast forward quite a number of years, I had come across this phenomenon called moral injury, and my own descent into being unwell had two parts to it. One was a more conventional clinical diagnosis linked back to my service days, and the other was moral injury. How I had been affected. I had witnessed things. I had been part of things that violated my core moral being, and it took until 2021 until I underwent some treatment that, well, half a year's worth, that eventually improved my health a great deal. I hadn't been part of the Methodist Church I hadn't been an active part of the Methodist Church for 10, 12 years. Maybe once in a blue moon I would turn up to something, but I started to explore my own moral injury at the end of 2021, and I met a whole bunch of chaplains for the first time in years. And I looked around the room and I thought, at least half of this lot are in as bad a state as I am, if not more. And on that very day, I said to the RAF chaplain-in-chief, or the retired chaplain-in-chief, I think we should investigate this. It took some time along the way. Met Paul and Aaron and Brian, and we tried to get some funding for a giant project, which we did not get. And then a wonderful phone call connected me to someone on this call who said, "We're interested in your work. We would like to support you to do this." And we broke it down. And so what we have here is a first phase of looking at moral injury in retired military chaplains. And part of the reason that we're looking at retired military chaplains was despite enthusiasm from two of the services, let me call them the senior two, despite the enthusiasm some years ago, it needed all three services to get on board, and that didn't happen. So we decided if we can't research with the serving chaplains, we'll look at retired chaplains. And along the way, supported by the Southampton district, the former chair of whom is here tonight, and the amazing PA who keeps the whole lot running, who's here tonight, they helped to recruit a whole bunch of Methodist ministers, mainly Methodist ministers, to have as a comparison group with the military chaplains. So them and Phil Maltby of the Methodist Church. So there's a good few people here tonight who have made this research happen, but the main thing is my colleagues and all the participants. And I would like to hand over to Paul to start to tell you some of what we found when we began exploring this fascinating group of people. And I will perhaps switch off my screen so you don't see my facial reactions as he's talking. Thank you, Paul. Please take it away.
Just let me get my screen. Okay, can everybody see that? Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. I'd like to share with you the results of this research survey that I've been doing together with Brian and Pete and Aaron, as well as my excellent PhD student, Serena Romanelli. And I want to thank our funders, the Time Moore Foundation. So our survey focused on this well-being and beliefs about faith and moral injury in military chaplains. So if you just speak briefly about moral injury, a little more about what it is, it's sort of this damage you feel to who you are as a person or what you believe as a result of you're sort of tainted through exposure to unethical acts or ethically questionable situations, right? And so there's a pretty broad and growing literature on moral injury now in a whole bunch of different professions: police, military, healthcare, education, religious organizations, and so on. But we were interested in, obviously, UK chaplains and civilian clergy, right? And so we went and collected some data. And we reasoned that chaplains in particular might be at risk of moral injury due to this sort of the conundrum that they face, the juxtaposition of the brutal and dirty realities of war with the kind of cleanliness and spiritual purity of faith. And trying to hold one with one hand and one with the other can be challenging, particularly so. Also, although many people in many service professions appear at risk of moral injury, we wondered whether chaplains might particularly face this kind of risk. And we developed a survey to sort of measure moral injury and well-being, and we ended up recruiting 58 retired UK military chaplains and 34 clergy, right? Primarily Methodist clergy. So not as many numbers as we would have liked, but enough to get a start, get a sense of this. And that's after we recruited many more people who didn't complete the full survey and that sort of thing. We asked them about measures of faith, well-being, and coping. Right. And at any point, if you have a question, you can put up your hand and we can chat about it. It's fine. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of sense of who we're talking about people primarily in their 50s, 60s, and 70s who had been serving for an average of 15 years and sometimes 20 or 25 years. The clergy were a little younger, the chaplains a little bit older. And there was a mix of both men and women in both samples, and a mix of people who were and weren't partnered. Pretty much white British was our sample. And most of the chaplains were identifying as Anglican or Church of England or Christian, and most of the clergy identified as Methodist. Right? I'm happy to go back and you can take a better look if you like about anything in particular. Now what I wanted to show you, we measured feelings of depression on this measure, a widely used measure of depression in the literature, right? A standardized measure. And what we found, according to this measure, the GAD-7, or sorry, we use the International Trauma Questionnaire. And it may be, according to this measure, that up to 40% of clergy, of chaplains, may be at risk of major depression. Right, so as you can see in this chart, green is good and yellow is okay, but as you get into the orange and the red and the dark red, you're at higher risk of being diagnosed by a clinician, right? And so those, you might wonder, okay, how high or low are those numbers? Those numbers are quite high. They're actually even higher than other service professions. In police officers, we've seen around 25 to 30% numbers in this range. In the UK general population, it's 1.5%, going all the way up to 12% for people with a history of bipolar disorder or depression. So we're talking double or triple the risk of other groups who are at risk, right? How does that compare to the clergy? Well, clergy are also not doing as well as they could. The number looks like 32% at risk of major depression. So higher than we would definitely like to see compared to these other groups like the UK general population. So it may be that performing service in these roles as chaplain and clergy are having an impact on the well-being of people doing it.
Apologies all. I think be having just a bit of a technical difficulty with getting Paul back. We'll give him just a moment.
Whoops. Hi, are we back?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay, let me try. Can you see my screen?
It's coming up, I think. Give us just a moment.
Yep.
Sorry, I guess my internet
Yes,
stuff
back to
there.
you.
Okay, thank you. Oops, let's just make it like so. Right, so we were at anxiety for clergy, we're at 23% for clergy, so that's still quite high. On top of that, we looked at PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And what we found is that among chaplains, we were looking at about 22% with clinical levels of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's compared to, 7% in community samples, all the way up to 75 in a clinical sample, right? But it's quite a bit higher. So veterans returning from war have higher rates, but these are people who are getting admitted to clinics and things like that. This is a much higher number than the general public, and it's a much higher than clergy, who are around 6% for PTSD. So civilians versus clergy are reporting quite a lot more PTSD, as well as a little bit more depression and anxiety, but both quite high. We also looked at well-being outcomes, and you can plot them so you can compare the two groups. Chaplains are blue and clergy are orange, right? And so here's one way to measure these things. It doesn't look that impressive, but we're just sort of focused on the group differences at the moment. And as you can see, chaplains were notably higher than clergy for PTSD in particular, but the rates were a little bit more similar for the other outcomes, right? When we take the average across responses. Next, what we can do is we can look at reports of problematic approaches to alcohol and drug use, right? There is a UN audit report that allows people to self-report to what degree they're experiencing sort of problematic use of alcohol and how frequently do they have events in their lives that they sort of say, the next day I was not very functional due to alcohol use. Is that something happening every week or every month or every year type situation? And as you can see, among military chaplains in the blue group, it's about 35% are above the clinical threshold cutoff for problematic alcohol use, whereas for chaplains or clergy, it's only about 9%. And so there may be something related to a problematic approach to alcohol and drug use, specifically among military chaplains, possibly as a coping mechanism to manage challenges that come with the job, or possibly due to camaraderie. We also used a modified version of this to look at problematic drug use, and the chaplains were scoring higher than clergy. There's no threshold cutoff for this kind of data. But what we can do is we can say, what's predicting this kind of thing, as we'll come to in a moment. We also looked at people's reports of how they feel about their religious faith. We asked things like, how religious do you feel on, these are all on a scale from 1 to 7. So 1 is just no, not at all religious, and 7 is very, very religious, right? And as you can see, people around a 5 or a 6, but chaplains are a bit lower than clergy, right? How frequently do you worship? Again, clergy quite frequently, chaplains a little bit less. How do you have a positive view of God? Clergy say yes, very high, about 6 and a bit out of 7 positive view of God. Chaplains similar, but a little bit less, right? And do you feel God is present in your life? Again, there's a bit of a difference. There were no differences in how problematic people felt God was or how positive they felt it was to use religious coping. But there was a difference where chaplains were at reporting higher rates of what they call negative religious coping, which is saying things like, I think these experiences are making me question whether God's angry at me, which may be something that's happening more frequently among chaplains than among clergy. Both groups said that their faith was somewhat strengthened through service and that they grew somewhat as people through service, and there weren't real differences there. So those were sort of moderately high. So there's sort of, I think you can think of this as sort of a double-edged sword, or there's positive and negative elements that can come from service and from this sort of role. But in some ways, chaplains seem to have more questions about their faith than clergy in our sample. Yeah. We also looked at then, okay, what's predicting outcomes? And one thing that came up was demographic factors. It turns out that younger chaplains are doing worse than older chaplains across the board, right? And we weren't entirely sure why that might be. So it could be in part due to the different conflicts where people were serving. It could be to different experiences with, say, military high command or different political decisions. It could reflect a broader generational trend where it's good to be, born in the 60s or 50s and less good to be born in the 80s or something like that. But we noticed that in our data, so we did control for it statistically in all other analyses. Also, people who said they've been to therapy were reporting worse outcomes overall, but it's probably because if you have poor outcomes, you then seek therapy. And those are similar findings to past work. And we looked at things like moral injury. How well does it predict well-being? And by the way, if there's any questions at all, I'm happy to stop at this point and chat with you about what I've said so far. You can put up your hand, for example, or...
Hey, Paul, let me just jump in and ask that you appreciate the engagement. Can I ask if you use those through the Q&A, and I just might put a couple to Paul, that have come up about the data, and then we'll get into things formally in the Q&A. One question is just if the data is split by sex for the pie charts, do we have gendered data in those?
So those, these are overall. When we look at whether men versus women score differently on all of our outcome measures, no, we don't find evidence of significant differences in how they score. And we have a relatively small sample, so we're not super confident whether there may be real differences if we could measure more people. But I'll note that in our similar survey of 700 UK police officers, we had plenty of statistical power to detect fine-grained differences. And again, there, men and women did not score notably differently on any of the same outcome measures.
Thanks. Just one more and then we'll roll. But James asks, how does the rate of alcohol misuse amongst chaplains compare to the military population in general? Did we compare those? So,
While we're having another issue with Paul's with Paul's screen. This question of alcohol misuse is an interesting one, and the comparison between chaplains and the civilian clergy was also an interesting one, because the clergy are almost all Methodist. And on one of the lighter moments in our research project, Aaron volunteered the thought that perhaps if 30 odd different Roman Catholic clergy had been questioned, it might have been a slightly different measure of the amount of alcohol consumed. So I think there could well be a denominational issue keeping the alcohol consumption of Methodists lower than many or some other potential denominations. I just add that in. It was a light-hearted moment, but I think also sometimes many a true word said in jest. I think it would be really interesting to do a cross-denominational study and see. Hopefully, oh, here's Paul back. Paul, I was just adding a little commentary about the Methodist aspect of alcohol use for the audience.
Oh, yeah.
Back
Absolutely.
to you.
Absolutely. Great. Is there any other questions before I go on?
Well, I'll just have one that asked, I'm not sure if you heard that one before things cut off, but did the rate of alcohol misuse amongst chaplains compared to the larger military population?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have those data. It could well be worse in the general military population. That's a good point. Yeah. Great. The next thing that we did in our survey, we didn't just look at sort of average reports, but we also said, what is predicting people's outcomes? And so we grouped them into well-being outcomes and faith outcomes. And I have plenty of results. We don't have to go into all the details, but I can give you some of the highlights here. And the first thing, of course, that we cared about was moral injury. And you can break it down to think about 3 different ways you can experience moral injury. One is through doing bad deeds or feeling guilty about something you have done yourself. I did a bad thing and I'm struggling with that. So in military samples, that is often a source of distress. We reason that would be less likely to be true of our chaplains and clergy. But you can also experience or report moral injury by saying, somebody else did something ethically questionable and it's affecting me. I can't stop thinking about that. Someone did a thing, and it could be a person coming to you during confession or one of the people that you're trying to help, right? And then a third source is feelings of betrayal by the organization, by leadership, and by members of their team that they're supposed to trust. And a feeling like their role now requires that they act in ways that raises questions about who they are as a person and whether they're still good, right? And this is a concern that a lot of people experience in police, in military, in a lot of organizations. Doctors are reporting a lot of impact from these feelings of betrayal, that like, I'm trying to be a good doctor, but the system won't let me, for example, is a common way that people are thinking about this. And in our police data, feelings of betrayal by police leadership was the single strongest predictor of people's outcomes. So we reasoned that that might be similar in this current sample. And we were somewhat right. So I have lots of numbers that I can show you. Not everything was significant, but as a general overview, feelings that you personally did something bad in the sample was not really predictive of anything. Feelings that other people were doing something bad was predicting problematic alcohol use, problematic drug use, lower well-being. And on top of that, feelings of betrayal predicted feelings of secondary traumatic stress, that other people's trauma are now hurting me. Feeling like there's barriers to support, but interestingly enough, lower rates of problematic alcohol use, which could reflect, I don't feel I'm connecting with my community, so I'm staying at home and not going out. We also looked at how well these 3 elements predicted people's reports of feelings of faith. And again, there's not very many interesting or significant findings, but a couple ones that stand out. Let's see, transgression. Other people who say other people were doing bad things report that they feel God was less positive. Whereas, interestingly, again, people reporting betrayal felt maybe God is more positive. Possibly if they're pulling away from the earthly institutions they're dealing with, they may be relying on their sense of God to manage that feeling. But it's a speculative possibility. So in other words, overall, There's very few effects for feeling like you did a bad thing, but when people feel others have been doing bad things, this can increase alcohol and drug use and reduce well-being. And people reporting betrayal have sort of two elements going on: higher stress and more barriers to support, but also lower problematic alcohol use and more positive views towards God, suggesting maybe a different strategy of trying to maintain well-being. And this is a somewhat different pattern from military and police samples. We also looked at these measures of different coping strategies or different coping styles. So we look at what we call cognitive and emotion regulation. Are you sort of engaging in acceptance or catastrophizing and so on? And we also looked at behavioral and emotional regulation. So to what degree are you seeking distraction or engaging in withdrawal or seeking social support, that sort of thing. And then we looked at how each of these is predicting outcomes. And again, there weren't very many findings, so I can quickly summarize that consistent with past work, people who reported better outcomes overall tended to engage in what we call positive reappraisal, positive refocusing, and planning. In other words, they are future focused. They're thinking about their next step. They're saying, you know what, despite everything, it's not so bad. I still care about other things. And here's what I'm going to do next. On the weekend, this is what I'm going to do. That kind of coping or mindset in these data and our past studies has been associated with generally better outcomes. On the other hand, people who experience or report worse outcomes tend to report engaging in the strategies of withdrawal, self-blame, rumination, and catastrophizing. Right? By rumination, they mean I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about it. I'm thinking about it again. I'm standing around thinking about it. Whoops. And catastrophizing, it's the worst. So together, leave me alone. I'm the worst. I can't stop thinking about it. It's very bad. This is the worst. You're the worst. This is a very negative and stuck way to think. And in our data, in these data and a bunch of other similar data sets, we keep finding this forward momentum, seeking support. What's your next thing? Where are you going? As a protective factor, as a good, useful strategy and a way to think that helps people report that their lives are okay. And people who are stuck and they're withdrawing and they're isolating and they're maybe engaging in alcohol or something, they're trying to cope and they're stuck coping, and this is generally associated with poor outcomes in this and all of our data sets. We also looked at what they call religious coping. I briefly alluded to this before, because positive religious coping is saying things like, I rely on the strength of my faith to get me through the hard times, right? Which is a sensible, intuitive feeling that a lot of people have. But what we find is that when people report that they tend to do that, they don't report better outcomes. They don't report worse outcomes. It's just not having a straightforward, on average, impact on everyone. It's just not seeming to have a clear impact. On the other hand, there's this negative religious coping. And this is, again, people who say things like, apparently God is angry with me. I don't know, I'm struggling with my faith right now based on how things are going. And this is predicting worse outcomes across the board. Higher moral injury, higher depression, higher anxiety, higher PTSD, higher secondary traumatic stress, higher problematic alcohol use, higher problematic drug use, lower well-being, and feelings that there's barriers to getting support. Right, so people who report that their faith is at risk due to the experiences they've had are maybe doing the worst in our sample. It's this damage to faith, which is sort of holistically spreading out to damage everything. And speaking of, we also look at faith variables. And what's interesting is that now positive religious coping is in fact predicting. So people who say, I rely on my faith to help me get through the day, say, I'm also more religious. I worship more frequently. My faith has been strengthened through my service. I feel God is positive and present in my life. And they don't say that God is more problematic. So actually, positive religious coping is doing something. It's not doing an impact on well-being, but it is having maybe a protective impact on faith itself. And then faith feelings, especially this negative religious coping, It's associated with, well, lower worshiping. My faith has not been strengthened through my service. I don't feel God is positive, they're saying, or I feel less positive. And they're saying less present and maybe more problematic. So this negative religious coping is a really stressful experience for chaplains and clergy. This question of, is God mad at me because look at what's happening? This is a struggle. Yeah. There is also a little bit of other good news. What we found is that overall, chaplains who reported that they felt integrated with the unit they served in generally had better outcomes. So again, this is a social strategy. It's a connection strategy. If you are a person who's serving and you integrate and make friendships and relationships with the people that you're serving with, then you tend to do better and manage better. So this might be worth thinking about. So just some overall conclusions, and I'll hand it back to Brian. It appears to be a relatively high level of distress among military chaplains and clergy, with 20 to 30 or even 40% reporting probable major depression, generalized anxiety, and around 20% of chaplains reporting PTSD. So that is a pretty intense rate. And there are, some questions around those numbers given our relatively small sample, but it raises questions about well-being broadly among chaplains and clergy as a whole. And we also saw some evidence that maybe chaplains could be at risk of problematic alcohol or drug relationships. So it's maybe something to think about or watch. Those reporting higher moral injury tended to have worse outcomes, especially when they felt there's other people transgressing or they felt feelings of betrayal from the organizations they're a part of. In terms of coping, better outcomes with things like positive focusing and planning for the future, and worse outcomes for things like withdrawal, blame, rumination, and catastrophizing. And religious coping, positive religious coping doesn't seem particularly helpful, but negative religious coping can be very detrimental, these negative feelings about serving. All right, and with that, that's my talk. I'm happy to chat with anyone. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul. As most of you think you'll see what Paul presented, there's a ton of wonderful data and things that ask interesting questions that we're seeking to know the answers to in different ways. So I think I meant to mention at the beginning of this, but certainly we intend to do that in a second phase of the study and interrogating some of those things, figuring out where those suggestions might be built out and expanded upon by people if we can actually continue to dig deeper and find out, read between the lines of some of those. But let me just invite Peter and perhaps Aaron, especially since you haven't had a chance yet to comment on this, just and ask the broad question. What do you find interesting about this, or what do you want to pull out and lift up, kind of in conversation there?
A ton of data, problematic data, really interesting. I guess I should say my background. I spent many years working in drug and alcohol services and mental health services as a social worker and an executive manager. I used to run detox and rehab, amongst other things. So one of the things I know from experience is the ways in which all of those issues are kind of interlinked. So Paul's broken them down really nicely into their separate silos, but we were having a conversation earlier about the relationship between alcohol and mental health and trauma as well. And coming back to that question about the relationship between alcohol consumption and chaplains and clergy, my assumption is that the higher rates of alcohol consumption amongst chaplains is down to context and drinking culture in the armed forces. So what the research, not our research, but what wider research robustly demonstrates is the relationship between alcohol-related problems and population-level consumption or subpopulation level consumption. So what that does is that the more alcohol that's consumed within a given population, the more likely there is to be the risk of a range of problematic alcohol-related problems, including dependent alcohol use as well. And just to say that, as Pete indicated earlier, as a Catholic and as someone who likes to think that there are some benefits to drinking, there's this idea of kind of what are called J-shaped risk curves, that if you stay within the unit levels, then there are some benefits around relaxation and socialization and all that kind of stuff. But for every unit you drink over and above that, then the risk becomes almost kind of exponential in terms of developing further problems. Sadly, the latest research is there's very little, certainly, physical benefit to consuming alcohol as well, and the harm. Paul, you might have a view on this. About the harms are essentially dose related, which is a bit depressing. So yeah, I think that point about culture, context, environment is critical to understanding alcohol-related harms, and just this idea that kind of risky behaviour then begets further risky behaviour as well. And what you see is an erosion of confidence and motivation as well, in terms of people losing ability to control those behaviours. So I got some things I could say in a bit about ideas around kind of recovery, discovery, but I'll add that in for now about just the relationship between what we tend to call complex needs. But actually, if you have an alcohol problem, you're far more likely to have a mental health problem. You're far more likely to experience. Sorry, Paul.
Follow up on the alcohol point briefly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. My understanding of the psychological literature on this point is that it's not so much how much you're drinking, though it is, but it's more how or why you're drinking. In other words, it can be an effective social lubricant, although I agree that the research seems to show there's no physical benefits.
Yeah.
There are also very important social benefits that can occur, social bonding and so on. So it's like many things, the real advice is some moderation can be useful if that's a part of your life. But too far, and more importantly, for the wrong reason. So again, like drinking alone, drinking to forget, that's the kind that you're really watching out for, or constantly.
I think the really important point about that is the argument that's always been made that somehow alcoholism is something that happens to a particular set of people in terms of a disease or an illness or whatever you want to call it. Whereas actually what we know is that actually you can have some risk factors that might predispose you to develop an alcohol problem. But if any of us drink enough alcohol, any of us can develop a problem with alcohol. And that's why the public health approach becomes really, really important.
Could I add another perspective as the teetotaler in the team?
Please. Thanks, Pete. Yeah, then I'll have a couple of things that I'll throw in. But yeah, go ahead, Pete.
I don't want to sound virtuous at all about this, because Paul mentioned extreme behavior or self-destructive behavior, and also mentioned the contextual element of it. And so for me, thinking about the military context, those who know me know that it wouldn't be fair to say that I'm something of a fitness enthusiast, because that does not nearly capture the obsession and self-destruction that has been part of my life for decades. And when I say self-destruction, I mean extreme physical things. And I know there's quite a number of chaplains who do extreme, not just weightlifting, but other ways that are not intentionally trying to break your body apart, but maybe trying to see how close you can get. And actually, I did end up breaking my body apart. So I had some. But everybody praises you when you're a fitness fanatic, or you can lift lots of weights. So everybody affirms you in your self-destructiveness. And it took therapy for me to realize that I was not exercising to be fit. I was way, way beyond that. I was exercising for other reasons. Fit was way in my rearview mirror. I was doing something else. And so I think it might not seem obvious, but I think there's something in common about the extreme behavior, about self-destruction, about coping and finding maladaptive ways of coping. I just happen to choose one that's socially acceptable, but actually it can be very physically harmful. And it's only in the last year or 2 or 3 that I've managed to moderate my training, so that I train much less, I train more healthily, and I'm not trying to push my body. Well, I'm almost 6 years old. I'm much easier to break now, but that was definitely part of my behavior for a long time. And this has thrown some interesting findings on myself. I've had to do a lot of reflecting on the results.
No, thank you, Peter. Yeah, and let me just say too, there's a couple interesting things I want to pull out of that as both a systematic theologian and somebody who, has been kind of thinking and wondering about moral injury for a long time in other respects as well. Let me say too, just a reminder, I know we're using the term chaplains a lot. The study was certainly focused on former military chaplains. It would be certainly interesting to perhaps conduct the study, if we were able to in any way, among serving chaplains. I think that would be really illuminating as well, to see what that data might provide for us. One of the aspects of moral injury that comes out, we talk a lot about the loss of things like loss of meaning or breaking down frameworks of meaning and the ways in which we understand moral order. One of the fine things that just struck me, Paul, as you were saying that is helpful, is looking at that worse outcome in terms of religious coping really seems to underline that in a very particular way, that if our moral framework and the thing that we've put a lot of trust in, especially so much so that we've sought ordination or formal recognition in our faith system, really collapses, that's really destructive for us. And that's interesting data to have. Certainly I'm editorializing that conclusion a little bit, but that's something I'd love to dig into a little bit more to see if that holds up in qualitative interviews, because that certainly seems to be one of those aspects that's a data point in kind of demonstrating that how difficult for us it is to process and kind of continue in that moral framework around which we've ordered so much of our lives and understanding of the world really starts to fall apart. As well, one of the things we talked about a bit in the study as well is participation. One of the things I was keen to ask, particularly of this group, is what does participation look like in one's faith tradition on the other side of military service? Because I think that is, another measure of how one's framework holds up amidst, amidst moral injury and the experience of conflict. And there's a lot of interesting things that we can talk about in that regard for chaplains, because at the beginning you come in with a framework of meaning. It's probably a safe assumption to make. Some of you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that means, there is a starting point to that strong moral framework that's quite discernible. Everybody probably has one, but chaplains have a particular one that allows us to interrogate a little bit. And so I think that makes this a really interesting study for some of those aspects in terms of how we understand moral frameworks, theological frameworks, religious practice, how all those things fit in. And so I'm really curious to ask and follow along some of the really interesting suggestions here in that next phase when we can interview some of the participants again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I'm not an expert in those traditions, but I understand the different ways of thinking about this. You might be more or less likely to feel that there's divine forgiveness is possible for you, and that might really impact your well-being. And people coming from different traditions or different views of faith may view these things in ways that are destructive or protective in their individual circumstances. And what we're doing here, of course, is we're sort of saying on average, if we ask 10 or 20 or 30 people, what's the typical response pattern we get? But in the next phase of the study, we're going to get a lot more fine-grained understanding of how does a particular person manage this tension between faith and reality.
Yeah, there's so much, like I said, and there's so many interesting aspects of this. Like I said, that we'll keep going with, but let me ask you, do we want to shift into different areas? I want to take about 10 more minutes for us and then open it up, because we've got some questions that I think people are posted in the box I want to get to soon. But what are the other aspects of things we want to follow on as a group here?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the really interesting parts of this this work is that ordinarily, if you're talking about recovery, overcoming problems, then what we know from the research is that people who are experiencing problems with moral injury, mental health, and so on and so forth, it's actually a process of developing sort of a crass phrase really, but kind of human and social capital to help to provide the supports and resources to address those problems. Ordinarily, of course, things like faith and spirituality would be one of those resources. But what we're talking about in this context is those are the very resources which, in some circumstances, have been shattered. So even even allowing for the fact that Christian spirituality, in many ways, is a spirituality of failure and dissent. Let me put it that way. This is a fundamental challenge to how we see these kinds of roles within something like the armed forces. But at a very kind of basic, if your spiritual view of the world has been shattered, where do you then go in terms of accessing further resources to try and make sense of that? Now, given the work I'm doing at the moment, which is a kind of full engagement of kind of theology and philosophy, I would actually argue that it's within those theological and philosophical traditions that we can actually find some of those resources. It's not something we can simply psychologize or behaviorize. And I know, and I'm quite happy. I've had a breakdown, and I know that those psychological approaches were really important, but there wasn't enough depth there to address the issues that I needed to address. So what we get from what we get from support services, I think doesn't go to the depth of what people ordinarily need who are experiencing these kinds of crises. I don't think I'm overgeneralizing.
No, I think that's really helpful, Aaron. Just one of the things we talk about here at the ICMI a lot, meaning it's important to me, is that the different conceptual languages being complementary in dealing with moral injury and trauma, that the conceptual language of, as you pointed out, psychology and psychiatry is so abundantly helpful in so many ways. And then if we can add to that a conceptual vocabulary that builds around those philosophical and theological resources and that help folks dealing with those existential aspects and frameworks of meaning, I find that so important. Let me just lift up one thing, then Pete, I'm going to flip over to you. One of the other things I wanted to lift up was, I find fascinating still, and I'm reminded of it when you talked about it, Paul, but that idea that those that have that other directed sense of moral injury, the transgression of others, struggle with that almost more than those. That was something that people seem to struggle with. That's what the data here suggested. For me, that's really interesting. I was in Afghanistan with the U.S. military when the Abu Ghraib scandal broke. And I remember just watching it and watching everybody in the military around me in different ways struggle with that sense that this was nothing anybody personally here had done, but that sense that somebody on my side did this, and it was really devastating to me and my sense of belief and my moral framework in our own goodness. And I think I would describe that somewhat confidently that way. That was a factor. That showing up here was interesting to me. That resonated with my own experience in that way, and I'd be interested again to interrogate that a little bit.
I think that makes a lot of sense
as we move.
Yeah, they call it, there's a term for it, like vicarious as well, like sort of moral injury, or this idea that other people are making me look bad. They're part of my group and they're making us look bad. And of course, if you're a military chaplain, there's two groups you could be worried about. You could be worried about your faith group community saying they're doing something in the news that you have to now defend other people that you may not agree with. And also the military people that you're operating with may act or report things that happen that don't mesh well with your moral standards. And so you might be getting it from two sides at the same time, being worried about how you're coming across, and this can damage. I also should say I found the questions. There's actually several. I don't know if we want to take a moment or two.
Let's go to Pete real quick, and then I'll pop into those.
I just wanted to take a moment on the institutional betrayal or being let down by your hierarchy as a key point, not only in moral injury in this study, but again in our policing study, it's the thing that stood out as the most morally injurious. These were police whose job was looking at investigating online child sex crime. and seeing indecent images of children. And that's what they did during the day. And that's their day job. And that was not what they came back with as the most harmful part of moral injury for them. It was being let down by their organization and by their superiors. On a personal note, that was my experience as a chaplain, sadly, towards the end. But equally, I don't want to be overly negative, because my years as a chaplain were some of the most professionally fulfilling, rewarding years of my life. And if I had to do them again and have the same outcome again, I would do it, because the positives outweighed the negatives. And I have much greater, as I've gotten older, I've got much greater sympathy for those who are in command in senior chaplaincy positions in the armed forces, because they serve two or three masters. If one is they're serving God, two, they're serving whatever church sent them. So they remain a minister of Methodist, Baptist, Church of England, Roman Catholic Church, whatever it is. And then three, they have the military hierarchy, and the military hierarchy, they are very task focused, and they may not be equipping you with enough chaplains or enough resource to meet the demands placed upon you. And so, although I've been affected myself, I have a great compassion for the senior chaplains who have got to make decisions that they themselves, I would imagine, are not comfortable making, but they have to do the best with what they've got in the circumstances they face. So institutional betrayal is a huge factor. I'd also say, as part of my recovery and my linking with the Methodist Church, that the other institutions, so although I have not been active as a, say, church minister for about 15 or 16 years, a few years ago, I was made very welcome when I eventually decided to start accepting some of the invitations from the local Methodist district to attend some of their events. And I went along, and that has been really therapeutic for me. I still have not preached a sermon in 15 or 16 years, but in that institutional setting with other Methodist ministers with whom I probably don't share a lot in common in our ministry experiences. And I've been in a university now for 16, 18 years. I have found great acceptance and recovery and healing from having a peer group who I understand. So it was the hierarchy, the institutional part has been too double-edged for me, and someone just put a very kind message on the box, and I need to stop talking now because I'm going to get emotional. Hi there.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you, Paul, Aaron, and Peter, for that wonderful conversation and illuminating presentation and discussion.